In 1986, two newlyweds vanished without a sound just miles from Yosemite's backcountry trails. No wreckage, no footprints, just the red Ford Bronco they drove, gone. 13 years later, when a drought finally pulled back the waterfall's curtain, a fragment of red metal reappeared along with a question that would haunt the forest forever. They had made it deep into the wild, but they hadn't come out. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Emily Halbrook. I'm from Stockton, California, born and raised. I was 21 when my sister Rebecca and her new husband Daniel packed their truck for a 4-day hiking trip in the backcountry. That was June of '86. I still remember how the heat shimmered off the sidewalk that morning, and how Rebecca's hand felt when she hugged me goodbye, rough from charcoal and paint, always just a little bit stained. She and Daniel had just come back from their honeymoon in Tahoe, but it wasn't enough for them. Not really. They hated the noise, the city, the endless run of brunches and thank you cards. They wanted something quieter, something real. Yosemite had always been that place for them. Off-trail deep woods, real solitude. It was their idea of sacred ground. Daniel had mapped everything out in that careful way of his. Topographical chart taped to their apartment wall route, marked in yellow highlighter, full list of water sources, stream crossings, even one note in the margin. Last day, Wapama Falls. He'd hiked parts of the John Muir Trail back in college. Rebecca grew up camping with our parents in the Sierras. They weren't reckless. They were prepared. They left Stockton the morning of June 4th in their old red Bronco, planning to return the evening of the 8th. Rebecca promised she'd call as soon as they got home. She always did. I watched them drive off from the curb. She had her window down, her hair blowing wild, and she waved until the car turned out of view. I didn't know then that it would be the last time I saw her. The first 2 days passed like normal. I didn't worry. But on the night of the 8th, the phone never rang. I figured they were delayed, maybe caught in traffic or adding a last hike. But when the 9th passed, then the 10th, I started calling hospitals, park offices, Daniel's parents. Nobody had heard anything. I filed the missing persons report on the morning of June 11th, and when I gave the deputy Rebecca's name, there was a pause. Not long, just the kind that settles in the throat when something already feels wrong. He said they'd send someone up to Hetch River to check the entry logs, but I already knew what they'd find, or what they wouldn't, because I'd seen Rebecca's handwriting on that map. I knew exactly where they were headed, and I knew. She wouldn't have stayed away unless something had gone terribly wrong. That night I sat at the foot of her bed and looked around their apartment. Everything was still in place, the map still tacked to the wall, her boots still drying by the door, their toothbrushes side by side. The silence felt too still, like something had been waiting to be noticed, like something was about to be lost. That's when the phone rang again, and this time it wasn't her. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. Deputy Ellison from Tuolumne County. He asked if I was still listed as Rebecca Halbrook's emergency contact. I said yes, and he didn't waste any time. We have a missing persons report filed this morning by you. We're sending 2 deputies to Hetch Hetchy entrance to begin search coordination. Do you have any additional details we should know? I could hear the radio chatter in the background, boots on gravel. I told him about the map in the apartment, the marked route, the note about Wapama Falls. He wrote it down. Then he paused, and I remember this clearly. He asked, "Was your sister the type to take risks?" I told him no. She was the type to prepare. She brought iodine tablets for water she didn't plan on drinking and backup batteries for a flashlight she rarely used. That seemed to change something in his voice. "All right," he said. "We'll keep you posted." From there, things moved fast. The park rangers had no record of Daniel or Rebecca checking in at Hetch Hetchy's back entrance, but that wasn't unusual. That entry point was remote, often unmanned. Permits were encouraged, but not strictly enforced. What they did have was a copy of the trail map left in the apartment. Daniel had marked campsites, water access points, and finally, Wapama Falls. Ranger Caroline Watts, who'd worked that area for over a decade, remembered that trail well. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't popular. She'd seen twisted ankles, panic calls from hikers caught on wet granite, even one case of a man needing airlift after slipping near the fall's edge. She told Ellison that if they'd gone that way, it would take a coordinated effort. By that evening, search and rescue teams were on the ground. Helicopters came in from Modesto, circling above the falls. Volunteers were paired off to check ravines and campsites. Nothing. No Bronco in the lots. No sign of a tent. No wrappers. No broken branches. Not even a footprint. Just the roar of falling water and forest stillness. For 5 days, the search grew wider. I stayed near the ranger station, sleeping maybe 2 hours a night. Every tip that came in, I wrote down. A gas station clerk in Groveland thought he saw Daniel buying trail mix. A hiker claimed she passed a dark-haired woman hiking alone near Lake Eleanor. None of it led anywhere. By the 20th, the official search was pulled back. Ellison called me himself. He said, "Emily, we're not giving up, but we have to shift resources." I knew what that meant. He didn't say it, but I could hear it in his tone. The headlines stopped. The flyers faded. But I couldn't. Every June, I returned to that same trailhead. I brought new flyers, updated photos, sometimes just stood at the edge of the parking lot and listened. The forest always sounded the same dry wind through pine needles, the occasional rustle of underbrush, distant water. But to me, it felt like it was keeping something. I kept everything. Ranger logs, weather reports, newspaper clippings, even notes from a woman in San Jose who claimed she'd dreamt of Rebecca near a stream. My parents didn't ask me to stop, but they didn't join me either. Our family just dimmed. Rebecca's things sat boxed in my attic. Her journals, sketch pads, a teacup with a chip that I never threw out. By 1993, our mother passed. Our father stopped answering calls from reporters. Daniel's parents moved north. But I stayed. I never really left. I always felt like they were out there, maybe buried, maybe lost, maybe waiting to be found. Then came 1999. California had one of the driest winters on record. Snowpack in the Sierras melted early, and by late spring, the rivers were low. Wapama Falls, usually a thunderous curtain of spray, slowed to a steady veil. And that's when it happened. 2 wildlife researchers, Dr. Helen Kwong and her assistant Jason Melvin, were out tracking osprey nesting sites. They decided to photograph the falls from an angle most people avoided low off trail near the granite ledge. Helen saw it first. At the base of the waterfall behind the thinned cascade, a shape. Rectangular, metallic. Jason climbed down and brushed at the moss. Faded red paint. Then a flash of silver. A license plate warped but legible. California tag. 4DHW 63. It took less than an hour for the call to reach Yosemite Dispatch. Ranger Watts responded herself. When she heard Wapama Falls come over the radio, she froze. She remembered the Whitaker case like it had happened last week. When she arrived, she found it exactly as described. A door panel wedged in stone, a twisted piece of roof buried in sediment, and then the frame deep in the rock bed, a rusted skeleton of a 1981 Ford Bronco almost entirely hidden by years of spray and silt. A few feet downstream, snagged in a root cluster, was a backpack. Blue nylon, zipper frayed. Inside, sealed in a plastic bag, was a water-damaged sketch pad. One image survived. Wapama Falls drawn in pencil, the angle exact. Rebecca's. Watts radioed in. "Secure the site. Nothing leaves this location until forensics arrives." Word spread fast. By June 3rd, the area around the falls was closed to the public. The state forensic team arrived the next morning. The license plate matched DMV records. But that wasn't what confirmed it. What confirmed it was the sealed thermos they found under the collapsed passenger seat. Inside were film rolls remarkably preserved. 5 photos were recovered. Rebecca in a stream smiling. Daniel crouching by a fire. The tent set up near a granite boulder. And one wide shot of the falls with their camp pitched just yards from the water's edge. It was dated June 6th. They'd made it. They were there. But no remains. No bones. No gear besides the backpack. Geologists proposed a theory. In early June of '86, an unexpected surge in snowmelt doubled the river's volume. A washout aslide could have swept their camp into the gorge, hiding the vehicle behind the waterfall's veil for over a decade. But something about that didn't sit right. When they brought me to the site, I stood still for a long time. Then I said, "This wasn't where they planned to camp." Watts turned. "What do you mean?" I pointed to the incline, the proximity to the water, the slick moss. Rebecca wouldn't have pitched a tent here. She was cautious with terrain. Always chose higher ground ridges, runoff paths. Watts pulled out the original map. The last handwritten note said, "Last day Wapama Falls." It had always been assumed they camped there. But what if it wasn't a campsite? What if it was just a planned stop before heading out? What if the Bronco hadn't been carried there but moved? Forensics found the driver's seatbelt twisted and clipped with no pressure on the rails. No weight, meaning the seat was empty when it was fastened. The Bronco may not have been parked. It may have been pushed. That changed everything. A ranger came forward, Harold Mendoza, retired. He said he remembered seeing a man that week, June 6th or 7th. Alone. No permit. Limping. Said he was camping off trail. Gave him a bad feeling. Never got a name. But after 13 years, that memory stuck. A man with a limp. No registration. No camp. And no reason to be there. I stood at the edge of the ravine, the falls behind me. It was quiet. The search had changed now. This wasn't just a disappearance. Something else had happened out here, and someone else had been here when it did. The name Ethan Voss didn't come up right away. For a while, all we had was that partial description from Ranger Mendoza, white male, maybe mid-30s at the time. Heavy limp, no permit, alone. He hadn't logged his name, hadn't offered it. Said he was just camping off trail. Mendoza said he remembered the man because something about him felt wrong. Not in a dramatic way. Just not right. Like he didn't care that he didn't belong out there. At the time, it wasn't enough to pursue. But now, with the Bronco recovered with the seatbelt twisted and the camp all wrong, it became something more. A direction. Detective Linda Monroe was assigned to the case after it was reclassified from a missing persons file to a suspicious disappearance. I met her on a Tuesday in July. She was methodical, quiet, maybe in her early 40s, and she carried a black legal pad that looked like it hadn't left her side in years. She listened more than she talked. Let me walk her through the map Daniel left Rebecca's hiking habits, what I remembered from those final calls. Then she said something I didn't expect. "I want to go there. Not just the waterfall. I want to walk it the way they did." I offered to go with her, but she shook her head. "I need to see it as fresh as possible. Just what's on the page." So she went. Hiked in with a ranger and 2 deputies. Traced the trail from Lake Eleanor all the way to Wapama Falls. She took photos notes, soil samples. And about halfway through she found something. An old offshoot trail, narrow and overgrown, not listed on any modern map. It peeled off from the main route, hidden by underbrush and pine, and led to a clearing, small flat, ringed by tall trees. A stone circle hinted at a fire pit. No tent remnants, no trash. But something about the space felt used. Not recent, but intentional. She marked the coordinates and came back with a forensics team the next morning. That's when they found the pouch. It was buried shallow just beneath the surface. The zipper was worn but intact, and inside was a notebook. Daniel's. The handwriting was his tight and slanted, same as his class notes I'd kept in a box at home. The first pages were practical trail conditions, meal lists, campsite notes. But partway through the tone shifted. June 6th. Hiked south toward Wapama. R's knee sore from yesterday's climb. Stopped earlier than planned. Set up camp near Creek Bend. Flat ground shaded quiet. The location matched the offshoot trail. It wasn't by the falls. It was upstream nearly 2 miles from where the Bronco was found. Further entries talked about cooking, sketching, reading aloud. There was a line that made me pause. Things to do when we get back. Fix roof leak, print film, call M. But near the end, the writing changed again. June 8th, 5:10 p.m. Strange man passed by camp around noon. Didn't speak, just looked, then walked on. Tan jacket limp. R unsettled. Tried to play it off, but something felt off. And then the final entry. June 9th, 6:45 a.m. Heard something last night. Footsteps. 2-legged slow. Not animal. R thinks we should leave early. I agree. Writing this fast. If we're not back by the 12th, something happened. We saw someone we weren't supposed to see. That line sat heavy on the page. Monroe said she read it 3 times before closing the file. She contacted the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit the next day. The evidence now pointed to premeditation. A man seen twice by 2 different rangers, unidentified, limping. Present during the exact time frame Daniel and Rebecca were last seen. The BAU reviewed the case focusing on behavioral markers. Special Agent Derek Holloway, who'd worked multiple disappearances along the Appalachian Trail, reviewed the file. His initial call with Monroe was brief. If this man is responsible, he didn't act out of panic. He waited. He moved the Bronco. He chose concealment. That suggests familiarity with the terrain. Monroe pressed further. She asked the National Park Service for any unusual incidents logged in that region from 1986. One stood out. June 7th. A ranger named Don Sutter had filed a short note about an encounter with a man fishing illegally near Tiltil Creek. The man refused to give a name. Matched the same physical description, mid-30s, limp, unkempt beard, traveling alone. Monroe tracked Sutter down in Oregon. He remembered the man clearly. Said he gave off the kind of stillness that doesn't belong to someone just enjoying nature. When pressed, he said I asked where his camp was. He just smiled. That was enough for me to walk away. Monroe had a composite sketch made from both ranger accounts. It was vague but distinct. She pushed it through law enforcement databases, cross-checking anyone with a criminal record in Northern California between 1980 and 1987. 2 names surfaced. One was in prison during the disappearances. The other, Ethan Voss. Born 1950. Prior arrests for trespassing, unlicensed hunting, and assault during a land dispute. Last known address, Groveland, California, 35 miles west of Hetch Hetchy. He'd suffered a left leg injury in a logging accident back in Oregon, 1978. Limp consistent. He was released from county custody in late 1985. After that, nothing. No forwarding address, no property, no bank accounts, no death certificate. He had simply disappeared. Monroe pulled his mugshot and laid it next to the sketch. The resemblance was striking. She called me that night, didn't say much. Just that a name had surfaced, one they couldn't verify, but one she couldn't ignore. I asked if she thought he'd killed them. She didn't answer right away. Then finally, if he did, he's not just hiding. He's been hiding for a long time. That was the first time I heard it said aloud. That this wasn't just someone who snapped or made a mistake. This was someone who knew how to vanish, who knew how to wait. The last known sighting of Ethan Voss was a misdemeanor citation for loitering in Oakdale in October 1986. After that, he became smoke. Monroe wrote 3 names on her office board that week: Daniel Halbrook, Rebecca Halbrook, Ethan Voss. The dates aligned. The geography aligned. The silence fit too well. And the more she looked into his record, the more she started to ask something that made my stomach turn. What if Daniel and Rebecca weren't the only ones? And what if Voss never left the woods at all? When Monroe first brought up the idea that Ethan Voss might have done this more than once, I didn't know how to respond. The thought had been sitting somewhere in the back of my mind ever since I saw the condition of the Bronco and read Daniel's journal, but hearing someone say it aloud, someone who'd seen cases like this before, made it real. It meant this wasn't just about my sister and Daniel anymore. It meant there might be others. Monroe started requesting files, missing persons reports from park jurisdictions across Northern California, Oregon, Idaho, even parts of Montana. Not every one of them matched, but a few. They lined up too cleanly to ignore. Always rural, always solo or paired hikers, always in places with limited ranger coverage, poor cell reception, and unpredictable terrain. Between 1986 and 1995, there were 5. Some were names I'd never heard before. A young man in Idaho who vanished during a fly fishing trip. A couple in southern Oregon, last seen filling up at a gas station before heading toward a lake trail that barely showed up on maps. None of the cases had ever been solved. Most had gone cold before a year was out. But in 3 of them, there were notes, brief, almost throwaway details about a man with a limp traveling alone, no clear destination. Monroe started building a board in her office. Not just Daniel and Rebecca anymore, but 5 more names pinned with photos where they had them and yellow markers where they didn't. The sketch of Voss stayed at the center. She drew lines between dates, locations, sightings. What she saw was a path that didn't follow roads or seasons, it followed isolation. One of the missing men, a 24-year-old named Jonas Weaver, had disappeared in 1994 near Kalispell, Montana. His car was found parked legally at a trailhead. His name had been written in the registry logbook, but no one ever saw him again. That file had been closed without leads. Monroe called the local authorities and asked them to reopen it. A few days later, a woman named Margaret Shields called the sheriff's office. She was in her 60s now, retired, still living in Kalispell. She remembered the summer Jonas disappeared because she'd worked at a small trailhead campground nearby. And that summer there'd been a man staying on the edge of the woods for weeks. Said his name was Eli. Kept to himself. Limped badly. Claimed he was writing a book about isolation and human behavior. She said he gave her a drawing once. Still had it. Monroe flew out 2 days later and brought the sketch back with her. It was a wooded glen, quiet and finely detailed. But in the corner, half faded and almost hidden in the shading, was a figure small hunched watching from a ridgeline. The signature matched the one found in the Yosemite sketchbooks. Monroe put it up next to Daniel's journal and the sketch from the pouch. The lines matched. The weight of the pencil, even the way the capital letters curved. She didn't say anything right away, just set the paper down gently and stared at it. Then she pulled out a red pin and added it to the board beside Jonas Weaver's name. After that, she sat down across from me in silence. We were both starting to feel it now, that sense that we weren't chasing a question anymore. We were chasing a pattern. Holloway from the BAU called a day later. It's rare, he said, but it's possible. There are offenders who don't operate in towns or cities. They stick to forests, trail systems, places where presence is easy to hide and disappearance is even easier. He described them as directional predators, people who don't just use wilderness, they live in it, disappear into it, build routines in places where no one looks unless something goes wrong. Monroe started calling them quiet zones, these patches of trail and backcountry that sit between ranger patrols and populated campsites. Places with no cell towers, no tourist traffic, no cameras. Places someone like Voss could learn over years, even decades. And then, something strange happened. One of Monroe's contacts sent her a message from a private forum. It was a survivalist board, mostly anonymous, mostly just old men talking about bear encounters and solo winter shelters. But someone had posted a message that caught her attention. Saw a man in '09 near the Bob Marshall Wilderness. Said his name was Ellis. Limped. Kept sketching trees and asking about people who traveled alone. Gave me a look I didn't like. Gave me a drawing I didn't keep. The user was traced back to a man named Keith Delaney, a former smoke jumper living in Spokane. Monroe drove out to meet him. He confirmed the sighting, said it had stuck with him for years. The man had asked about his route, how long he planned to stay, whether he traveled with anyone. Said it was under the guise of curiosity, but it didn't feel like small talk. Delaney told her the man headed toward a place called the Chinese Wall, a sheer limestone escarpment running 20 miles across the Montana wilderness, one of the most remote regions in the lower 48. No roads, no official trails. Monroe circled it on the map. It matched the movement pattern. Every few years, always moving north, always slipping deeper into places with fewer eyes. She brought the evidence to the FBI. Holloway signed off on the next phase. Not recovery. Not evidence gathering. A manhunt. They formed a small team, 12 total. Wilderness agents, forensic techs. Monroe would go in with them. Holloway stayed behind to coordinate. They used wildlife survey permits as cover to avoid drawing attention. No press, no alerts. Just one directive: get close enough to confirm if he was still there, if he was alive, if he could still be found. The team left late summer. Monroe didn't tell me exactly where they'd be, only that she'd call if something changed, and that if they found anything at all, she'd be the one to tell me. She kept that promise. 3 days into the search, they found a cold fire ring beneath a cluster of evergreens. A tarp shelter collapsed but intact, and underneath it, tied in fishing line and plastic wrap, was another notebook. This one was full of sketches again, not of landscapes, of people, hikers, rangers, a man sitting by a creek, a woman with a red braid, and one that made Monroe stop breathing for a moment, a sketch of herself kneeling beside the very fire ring where they now stood. It had been drawn before she ever knew she was being watched. She didn't sleep that night. Neither did most of the team, because the truth was plain now. Voss wasn't hiding from them. He knew they were coming. He was already watching, and he had been possibly since the day they stepped into the woods. The drawing of Monroe kneeling by the fire ring wasn't the only thing they found that day. Tucked between the pages of that same notebook was a single line written in block letters, not matching the sketch style, not even in the same hand. Some animals chase their shadows. Others know when they're being hunted. That was all it said. No date, no signature. Just a sentence left like a thread for someone else to pull. And Monroe did. She didn't tell the full team what she was thinking, but I could hear the change in her voice when we talked. This wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about understanding what kind of person they were really dealing with. That night, they set up a decoy camp about a half-mile down from the shelter, made it look casual. Half-covered packs, empty fire pit. A couple of weathered mugs left in view. Monroe stayed behind near the original shelter, hidden in a camouflaged blind with 2 agents and a drone operator. She told them not to move unless they had a confirmed visual. No lights, no noise, just wait. And they didn't have to wait long. Right before sunset, the drone picked up movement. One thermal signature, human height, left side lagging slightly, confirming the limp. It came in slow stopping every few steps, like it was testing the air, pausing behind trees and brush. Then, without warning, it vanished. Mid-step. Gone from thermal. Gone from sight. The agents swept the area. Nothing. No broken branches. No footprints. Just a note, left under a flat stone beside the trail. Pencil on folded paper. I don't live in your world. You stepped into mine. Turn back. Some things aren't meant to be found. That was the second time the phrase showed up. Monroe kept it. Didn't send it back with the evidence bags. She folded it herself, slid it into the front pocket of her field notebook. She told Torres, "He's not hiding, he's directing." They spent that night mostly in silence. One of the younger agents, Jason Hale, packed up the next morning and flew out with the resupply chopper. He said he didn't feel right being out there anymore. Said it felt like they weren't the ones looking. They were the ones being counted, watched, measured. Monroe didn't argue. Everyone had their limit. By day 8, they narrowed their focus to a stretch of terrain locals called Witch's Hollow. Not on any formal map, but known to a handful of wilderness guides for its steep ravines and unpredictable fog cover. Hard to access, easy to get turned around. They moved in carefully, no heavy gear, no chatter, just climbing ropes, topo maps, and the quiet kind of resolve that comes when there's no other way forward. The shelter they found there wasn't like the first. This one was older, dug out of the slope, reinforced with stone and timber, hidden under brush so thick it had to be cleared by hand. Inside it was colder, darker but well-preserved. A small wood stove vented through stone, a moss-lined water collection system, and a layout that spoke of long-term use. Monroe said it felt like a space someone had returned to over and over again. There were shelves, makeshift but deliberate holding cans, journals, sharpened charcoal spools of twine, and there were drawings. Dozens. Some folded, some curled at the edges. Faces, names, places. A ranger looking through binoculars. A woman brushing snow off her jacket. A lone figure at a fire. Each drawing had either a date or a set of initials. And in the back corner, stacked under a folded tarp, they found a crate with something different. 6 personal items, carefully wrapped in cloth and labeled by hand. 2 driver's licenses, a broken pair of glasses, 3 rings, and a locket. Not Rebecca's, the one I'd grown up seeing around her neck, but nearly identical. Same style, same etching pattern. When Monroe opened it, there was a small photo tucked inside. A woman. Not Rebecca. Different eyes, but the same look in her face. Frightened but calm. Or maybe beyond frightened. She had the look of someone who'd been quiet for too long. Monroe didn't say much after that, just recorded the scene, sealed the items, and stepped outside. That's when Torres pointed to the ground outside the shelter entrance. A single footprint. Deep. Recent. Left foot dragging slightly. They hadn't found Voss. He had found them. And for the first time, Monroe admitted to herself and to Holloway that they weren't just walking a trail he'd once taken. They were inside the one he still walked. Back at the primary camp, they began sorting the drawings. One stood out a rough map sketched onto thick paper stained with oil at the edges. 3 marked locations, each with a number beneath it. Monroe cross-referenced it with ranger maps from the 1980s. It pointed toward the old Scapegoat Plateau remote, nearly impassable terrain where a mine had collapsed decades earlier. She circled the 3rd mark and said, "He left this on purpose." Torres didn't answer, just packed his gear and made a note on the corner of the crate. Site 3. They moved the next day. The climb was brutal, loose shale, fallen timber dead zones for radio signal. At one point, Monroe lost her footing on a slick boulder and skinned her hand badly. They pressed on. The site wasn't visible until they were nearly on top of it. A rock overhang just enough cover to break the weather, and inside 3 alcoves dug into the hillside. In the smallest one, they found something that changed everything. A Polaroid. Faded, creased at the corners, pinned to the wall with a rusted nail. Rebecca. Bruised. Alive. Seated on the floor of a shelter looking directly at the camera. Eyes wide, mouth closed, shoulders drawn in. Beneath it, written in faded marker, "They stayed." Monroe stood there for a long time, not speaking. Then she carefully pulled the photo free and slid it into an evidence sleeve. Torres moved through the rest of the alcove, found more personal effects. A cracked mirror, a toothbrush, a coil of rope, a children's shoe blackened by age. No remains. But the weight of what they had found was enough. This wasn't a kill site. This was a place of storage, a place of ritual. As they prepared to leave, Torres called out. Movement. West slope. Large figure moving slow. Monroe and 2 others gave chase, weaving through trees and rock. They reached a clearing, but it was empty. Nothing but a stack of stones in the center, and another note, this one even simpler. They asked to stay. You're the ones who keep digging. 6 figures drawn below it. 5 lying down. 1 in a tree. Monroe didn't speak the whole hike back, and that night by the fire, she finally said it aloud. He kept them. For how long, I don't know. But he watched them, drew them, marked them. Then she looked at the photo again, holding it close to the firelight. And Rebecca. She saw him. That was the moment everything changed. The moment this stopped being about a disappearance, and became something far more disturbing. Because now the question wasn't just what had happened back then. It was whether someone had been there the whole time and might still be. It rained for 2 days straight. Cold, steady, unrelenting. The kind of rain that settles into your bones and turns everything to mud. The camp had to be reinforced with tarps and gravel-stuffed ditches to keep the water from seeping into gear. Radios cut out. Drones were grounded. Monroe spent most of that first night in silence, watching the tree line while steam curled off her jacket. Torres had pulled the last watch before dawn, pacing the outer perimeter when he noticed something sitting just inside the edge of their detection grid. Not thrown. Placed. A tin can. Old, burnished with rust, sealed with a crimped metal lid. Inside was a strip of animal hide, a charcoal nub, and a folded piece of paper. On it, another drawing. This one showed Monroe asleep in her tent, curled toward the storm, her sidearm barely visible beside her hand. The sketch was clean. Too clean. Proportions exact. Lighting correct. It meant Voss hadn't just been near the camp, he'd been close enough to observe her sleeping posture, close enough to render it from memory or sight. And no one had seen him. The next morning, Torres found another sign. Just beyond the south trail, a narrow branch had been twisted into a figure 8, not broken by wind, bent by hand. A smear of soot marked the base of a pine trunk nearby. Small gestures, quiet signals. Nothing accidental. Monroe called it a language, said he was speaking in symbols and patience. They widened the search again. One of the dogs, part of a cadaver unit flown in from Sacramento before the weather turned, caught a scent near a flattened patch of earth under a large fir tree. They began to dig. Not deep, maybe a foot just below the layer of damp pine needles. Underneath was a tarp, green knotted tight. Inside it, remnants. A canvas jacket, broken zipper, cracked buttons, a silver chain. One of the dog tags looped around what was left of a wrist bone read C. Renner, a name that had shown up in Monroe's file from 1998. A hiker from Wyoming reported missing near the Absaroka Range. This was his final mile. The grave hadn't been dug with care. It was shallow, barely disguised, but it hadn't been disturbed until now. The evidence was logged, but Monroe didn't linger over it. She stepped back and looked toward the ridgeline, eyes scanning the mist as if waiting for something to answer. That night, she told Holloway over a shaky connection that it wasn't just about Voss anymore. There was something else happening here, something built on rhythm, not impulse. She didn't use the word ritual, but she didn't have to. Back in camp, she sat alone under the tarp and stared at a note she hadn't shown anyone yet. It had been tucked into the same can as the drawing of her, smaller, written on the corner of a map torn from an old guidebook. "You're still too loud," it said. She was better at quiet. Monroe didn't sleep much after that. At sunrise, they began moving east, following the last mark from the crude map found in the second shelter. The coordinates pointed toward a patch of land above Greystone Pass, steep, uninhabited, and near a collapsed rail line that had been abandoned since the 1970s. The area was known for steam pockets, loose shale, and sudden weather drops. It wasn't a place people went anymore. That was exactly why Monroe wanted to go. The team split. Torres went with Monroe. 2 agents took the southern climb. The wind came hard off the ridge that day, blowing grit into their faces, making radios nearly useless. But the terrain narrowed just enough to funnel them through a natural cut in the slope, where they found what they hadn't even known to look for. A wooden box, recently disturbed, unearthed by the rain. Inside 6 rings, a pair of reading glasses frames bent. 2 state-issued licenses, badly weathered, the photos nearly erased but just visible enough to identify gender and general age. And a second locket. Same shape, same design, different photo. When Monroe flipped the lid, she said nothing, just closed it again and pressed the box to her chest. The names associated with the IDs matched 2 other missing persons reports, both from wilderness cases in the late 80s. Neither had been tied to Voss until now, but there they were, in the box, in his ground. On the underside of the box's lid scratched with a blade or nail. They belonged here. You don't. It was another message, and Monroe took it personally. That night, while the others tried to sleep, she cataloged the items by firelight and made a separate list in her own notebook. Not just names, not just dates, but details: what they'd carried, what they'd worn, how long they'd been missing. She wasn't making a case file anymore. She was building a ledger. The next morning, Holloway called in with something unexpected. A ranger at a small checkpoint near the Canadian border had flagged an older man trying to pass through with an outdated passport under the name Eli Vaughn, white male, late 60s, limp. Said he was traveling alone. The ranger logged the sighting, stepped away to call it in. By the time anyone responded, the man was gone. Left nothing but a folded sketch pad in a trash bin near the washroom. When they opened it, there was only one drawing. Rebecca. Same eyes, same tilt of the head, but aged. Her hair longer, darker. Crow's feet at the corners of her eyes. She looked like someone in her 40s. It wasn't a memory. It was imagination or something else. He hadn't just watched her. He'd remembered her forward. The implication unsettled everyone. Holloway read the sketch as obsession. Monroe saw it as continuity. If Voss had imagined Rebecca aging, it meant he hadn't let her go. Maybe not even now. She asked for another sweep of all ranger logs between Montana and British Columbia going back 10 years. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be enough. This wasn't a trail anymore. It was a web. And somewhere out there, a man who understood silence better than any of them was still watching, still drawing, still waiting. The last entry in one of the recovered journals found wedged into a plastic-wrapped tin beneath the second shelter read, "I listen. They forget. That's why they vanish. I stay still." Monroe circled the sentence twice and didn't speak for the rest of the day, because what haunted her most wasn't the idea that Voss had been in the forest all this time. It was that he might never have left. They reached Greystone Pass just before dusk, the fog already creeping down the slopes like it had been waiting for them. There wasn't much left of the town, just the sagging bones of old mining cabins and the rusted ribs of what used to be a general store. But the depot was still standing. Tilted slightly, roof peeled open at one corner, but whole. Tucked just beyond it, camouflaged against the hillside, was the supervisor's cabin. The one old ranger maps had marked, but no recent crews had visited in decades. It was there, half sunken into the slope, that Monroe paused. No fresh prints, no signs of a struggle, just stillness. She held up a hand to Torres, and they circled wide, coming in from the high ground. The cabin was dark inside. No sound. No heat signature. But on the table, centered like an offering, was a leather-bound photo album. They flipped through it with gloved hands. Daniel and Rebecca, smiling, standing near a stream, a tent lit by lantern light captured from a distance. These weren't just photos taken on their trip. They were photos someone else had taken of them, from the trees, at night, through fog. One showed them eating dinner by the fire, Rebecca mid-laugh, Daniel reaching for something off-frame. And the last one, that stopped Monroe cold. It was Rebecca, older, sitting on the porch of that very cabin. Her hair was longer. She looked thin, but she was alive. The back of the photo had a date, October 11th, 1998, 12 years after she'd disappeared. Monroe stepped out to get air, heart pacing now in a way it hadn't since this case began. She didn't say anything at first, just stared up at the slope where the trees blotted out the stars. Inside, Torres opened a floorboard. Hidden beneath it was a journal. Small, faint writing. Rebecca's. Page after page of daily entries, most of them short. Descriptions of weather, what she ate, how many steps she took inside the perimeter she was allowed to walk. But then they started to change. He calls it the stillness, one read. Says, I'm part of it now. Another, I think of Daniel every day. He tried. He got between us. I hope someone remembers that. And finally, the snow came early. He hasn't returned. I don't know if this is freedom or the end. No remains, no blood, no fresh trail. Just the unmistakable weight of someone who had once been there. Monroe sat on the edge of the collapsed porch, journal in hand. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just looked back toward the clearing and nodded once. She believed it now. Rebecca had survived. For years. Long enough to write her story, even if it was never meant to be read. That night, the team stayed just outside the cabin's view. Sensors on the perimeter. Trail cams hidden in tree knots. At 2:14 a.m., one of the motion lines tripped. They checked the monitor. A tall figure barely more than a silhouette stood at the tree line. Not approaching, just standing. Then slowly the figure lifted its hand, not waving, just acknowledgement. By the time Torres reached the ridge, he was gone. But at the base of the pine where he'd been standing was another package, wrapped in canvas, tied with sinew. Inside was a camcorder dead battery early 2000s model and a single tape. There was also a handwritten note. 5 words. You still don't listen. They hiked out with it the next morning. Sent the contents straight to Quantico. The camcorder was nearly destroyed, but the tape inside had held. The footage wasn't long. Less than 5 minutes. Rebecca again. Older. Still thin. Speaking directly to the lens. If anyone finds this, she began, I want to be remembered not as a victim, but as someone who survived longer than anyone expected. She blinked slowly as if thinking through every word. He's not a monster. He's a believer. He says the silence is holy, that noise kills, that the loud ones always go first. She looked away for a second, then back. I stopped fighting. I don't know what that means anymore. I think I stayed too long. I think maybe I became one of them. She smiled just once. Sad. The waterfall was my idea. He didn't want to leave me. I made him. The tape ended. There was no timestamp, no sign of where it was filmed, just her voice echoing in the playback room. Monroe watched it 3 times, didn't say a word, then asked for everything from the cabin to be sealed and sent to cold storage, including the floorboards. That night she walked the outer perimeter alone, slow measured steps through damp grass. She lit a cigarette. First one in 10 years. What if we're not chasing him, she said to Torres when she returned. What if he's leading Holloway called her at dawn? The satellite team had picked up a heat signature 2 counties north just past the border. Remote. No trails. Natural hot springs in a dead zone near the timberline. Not many people knew about the spot. It had once been marked as an off-grid site in a ranger's personal field journal, not even in the federal database. Monroe looked at the map for a long time, folded it twice, then said, "That's where he'll be." Because it wasn't just wilderness anymore. It was a pattern. And if Voss was still alive, and after everything she knew he wasn't running. He was waiting, letting them follow, one trail at a time. The hike to the Borderland Springs was brutal even by Monroe's standards. Every step felt like the woods themselves were pushing back wet ice underfoot, branches clawing at jackets. The whole landscape tilted in silence except for the crunch of boots and the faint hiss of rising steam somewhere ahead. They moved without radios, each agent paired off with someone whose breathing they already knew by heart. Monroe led from the front head down, not because she wanted to get there first, but because she couldn't stand the thought of looking back anymore. By noon, they reached the lip of the basin. Clouds of mist clung low to the earth, and through that slow-moving veil, the roofline of a hand-built cabin revealed itself half-submerged in the slope built of timber so old it seemed to have grown there. Smoke drifted from a stone chimney curling into the trees. On a crude bench just outside, a man was waiting. He didn't move when the team emerged, didn't stand or raise his voice. Just watched them, his face older and more lined than in any of the mugshots, hair gone gray, the limp more pronounced. Monroe kept her weapon down, as did Torres, but their hands stayed close. She stepped forward and spoke first, calling him by the name everyone in the files already knew, Ethan Voss. He met her gaze, eyes steady but hollow, and answered in a voice so flat it sounded almost rehearsed. "You made it too loud," he said, all this noise for the woman who wanted quiet. Monroe pressed, asking about Rebecca. He turned away slow and deliberate and pushed open the cabin door. "She was here," he said, "for a time." Inside, the air was stiflingly warm from the stove. The space was clean, almost surgical in its organization. Books, field notebooks, stacks of old tapes, and along the far wall a small grave marker. Rebecca's name. Beneath it, dried wildflowers, carefully arranged, none more than a few days old. Monroe crouched and touched the wood, looking for anything, an inscription, a date, a sign she'd been here recently, but there was nothing but her name. She turned to Voss. "Did she die here?" For the first time, a tremor flickered across his face. He nodded once. "She asked me to bury her in the quiet," Torres whispered. "Do you believe him?" Monroe's jaw worked, but she didn't answer, not directly. She searched the shelves, careful and systematic. They found dozens of tapes, old, brittle, most labeled with years or seasons. There were photographs, too many of them, Rebecca at different ages, sometimes smiling, sometimes just staring past the camera. Some pages were written in her hand, some in his, some in others, a mix of stories that would take years to sort through. One line from a half-torn journal page caught Monroe's eye. "Not all who vanish are taken. Some walk willingly into silence." They processed the scene with gloved hands and slow care logging every artifact and item, but Monroe moved with a weight that didn't lift even as they placed Voss in cuffs and read him his rights. He didn't resist, didn't offer any confession, just the same cold quiet like the trees outside. At trial, he refused every plea, ignored every chance to explain himself. Even with the mountain of physical evidence, DNA journals, photos, he kept to silence. The prosecutors didn't need his words. They had years of patterns, names, artifacts that told the story for him. Monroe sat through every hearing face unreadable. The only time she flinched was when a forensic tech played back a tape from the cabin. Rebecca's voice, thin and scratchy, saying, "I hope someone is looking." I hope they remember Daniel tried to save me. After the conviction, after the press lost interest and the appeals ran dry, Monroe drove alone to Greystone Pass. She walked the ghost town's edge past where the station once stood and listened not for footsteps, not for Voss, not for any echo she could chase down and lock away. She listened for the quiet that had drawn them all out here in the first place. There was no justice, not really. No answer that could bring Rebecca back or explain the lure of a man who saw stillness as holy. Only the endless wind through pines, the chill of the air, and a truth that settled in her chest. Some disappear because they're lost, and some because the silence calls them by name. That night she left a single wildflower on the rail platform and walked back into the dark, never looking over her shoulder. The case was closed, but the woods, those would never be finished. It's strange the way certain moments linger after everything else is finished. The trial, the headlines, the stacks of files, all boxed and labeled in evidence rooms, nobody visits. Sometimes it's just the hush of late evening, the way a lamp throws shadows across the kitchen wall, and suddenly I remember the trees. The cold bite of mountain air, the silent shape of that last cabin, and the names that once echoed in search parties and family phone calls. Rebecca's name still not carved in stone, but alive in every wildflower and ripple of water that runs through those woods. There are mornings when I walk my own neighborhood and catch myself listening for footsteps that aren't there, thinking about the ones who went missing not by accident but by design or by some need I can only guess at. Torres keeps in touch now and then. He sends updates on other cases, most of them smaller, less haunted. He told me once he still dreams of Rebecca's handwriting, the neat looping letters in the journal, the quiet strength in every page. Sometimes I look at her picture and I'm reminded not everyone who vanishes is lost, and not every mystery has a clean ending. Ethan Voss will spend whatever years he has left behind concrete and steel, but the questions don't lock away so easily. I think of Daniel, of families who sat year after year with no word, no body, no way to mourn, except in the silent spaces that loss creates. For those left behind, the world doesn't ever return to what it was. You learn to carry the weight. You learn to listen for quieter things, the sound of a branch falling, or wind pushing through tall grass, or the memory of a voice promising they'll be home soon. I don't know if justice is ever complete. Maybe it's just the best answer we can give to the ones who can't speak for themselves. But I do know this: the land remembers. The river carves new paths, storms come and go, but the woods keep their secrets. Sometimes they give one back. That's what I hold on to in the end. If you made it all the way here, maybe this story touched something in you too. If it did, leave a word for the quiet ones so none of them are ever forgotten.